There's a myth going round town that when you get older you just sit down and start rocking, just rocking. In a way that's true, if you know what I mean. Just take a look at the senior scene. Well, it's rockin', yeah, it's rockin'. We're pulling our weight, learning the code, clicking our heels, sharing the load, and every so often we're hitting the road. Yeah, we're rockin'.
Greetings and welcome to In Praise of Age, a program for seniors and by seniors. We emphasize on In Praise of Age subjects of interest to our community. I'm Bobbie Lubker, and we're glad you're viewing. Today's subject is, as you've seen, the Blue Ridge Parkway Nobody Knows. This is about a book, a really wonderful new book that's out. Now, this is not a travel log. It's not about where to eat and where to rest on the Blue Ridge Parkway. It's sort of a political, economic mystery of history about the Blue Ridge Parkway. Our guest today is the author of the book. I want you to meet Ann Whisnant. Ann grew up, and nobody knows this but Ann and me and her parents and my parents. Ann and I went to the same same high school in Troy, Alabama, about 40 years apart. She then went on to Birmingham Southern. She has a master's degree and a doctorate from UNC Chapel Hill in history, and she has specialized in history of the South. Now, I'm going to look at this very carefully so I tell it just right. She has been a program manager for the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke, and she is now Director of Research, Communications, and Programs for the Office of Faculty Governance at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She and I are Southern girls who have done well. So, Ann, welcome to In Praise of Age.
Well, thank you.
Let's talk about the book. Why did you choose to write about the Parkway, Ann? That seems unusual.
Well, actually, I had spent summers as a child. You did mention that I grew up in Alabama, but in the summers, my father was a Methodist minister, and we would go to Lake Junaluska, which is the summer Methodist assembly grounds near Waynesville in Haywood County. And when I spent all the time there as a child, I fell in love with the North Carolina mountains. So as a college student, I came back to North Carolina and worked on the staff at Lake Junaluska. In the summers, I scooped ice cream and did those kinds of things, those jobs that you do when you're in college. Well, by the time I got to graduate school and was looking for something to work on for a dissertation topic, you have to write one of those to get out of history graduate school, you know, I came across in the library at UNC, I was in there one day searching for references to early birth control clinics in North Carolina.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
Because I had worked on a woman doctor in Alabama who had started a birth control clinic in the 30s, so I thought I would maybe continue on that line for my dissertation. But, you know, everyone will remember the card catalog that used to be in drawers before the computerized card catalog, and I was going through the drawers for birth control clinics, flipping through the cards, and by accident a card fell open that said Blue Ridge Parkway, Cherokee Opposition. And having spent all this time out in western North Carolina, including many trips to the Parkway, that sort of caught my eye. And I went up to the desk with the card and said, well, what's this all about? And they brought out whatever the document was, and I began to see that there was something to be said about the Cherokee opposition to the Blue Ridge Parkway. So from there, kind of pulled that thread and wrote a seminar paper about Cherokees and the Parkway, and that then led to a dissertation about the Parkway and then on to the book. But it really all started with Lake Junaluska.
How did you choose this title?
The title came from an article that was written in the 30s by a man named Stanley Abbott. And he was the first employee of the Parkway, hired by the National Park Service in the 1930s. He was a landscape architect. He was in his 20s at the time, had worked some in New York on the Westchester County Parkway system there, but came down here and was hired to design and direct the building of this new parkway that had been approved only a few years before. And he wrote an article in the 1930s describing what he was trying to do with the parkway and referred to this super-scenic motorway that will be great for America. And I just took that little phrase out for the title. And coming up with a title of a book is really hard. This is about the 6th or 7th title that I had on the way to finalizing something that would work.
And Gone with the Wind is taken.
Gone with the Wind was already taken, that's right.
Well, tell us a little bit about the basics about the Parkway. The where, when, why, and how. Who built it? Who manages it?
Okay, I think you maybe, there may be a slide coming in a minute that will show you a map of the Parkway, but basically the important things to know are that the Parkway connects the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia with the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina and Tennessee. It's 469 miles long, and its whole purpose was to join these two parks together. These two parks were both established in the 1920s. These were really the first major national parks in the eastern United States. There was Acadia in Maine, but otherwise all the national parks were in the west. So they began to develop some parks close to where people lived in the 1920s, and by the 30s, when the Depression had come, various people thought up the idea of why don't we connect these new two eastern national parks together with a parkway. As far as who manages it, it's a part of the National Park System, the National Park Service, which has 390-something units as a part of it. And it was built, though, as a part of the New Deal originally, Franklin Roosevelt's set of programs to address the Depression. And the federal agencies that were involved included the Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. We also often hear about them. There were a number of CCC camps. The Works Progress Administration, the Resettlement Administration, the Bureau of Public Roads, which was the national precursor to the Department of Transportation, and the National Park Service. So it was a complicated set of federal agencies. Plus, the states of Virginia and North Carolina had the responsibility for buying the land for the Parkway and getting it through their power of eminent domain and then giving it over to the federal government. So you had the states involved too. So it really was complicated for anyone who was encountering the project to sort of know who was in charge. It was started, finally I should say, started in 1930, it was approved in 1933. Construction began in 1935, but it wasn't finished until 1987.
Oh my goodness, I didn't realize it was that long.
It took a long time, mainly because of the final link at Grandfather Mountain, which was the big sticking point, and that took almost 30 years to resolve that.
Took place. Well, talk about the myths about the Parkway. Could you tell us what that means and what some of the myths have been?
I sure could.
I said this was a history mystery.
Yeah, it's a history mystery. It is, and I think you see a slide in a minute that shows a little log cabin. This is actually the Cool Springs Baptist Church near the Blowing Rock area. But what most people think about the Parkway, when they think about it, they think about beautiful views, the distant vistas that you see, and they envision, as far as any people that lived in the region around the Parkway, they envision those people to have been basically small farmers who were living in pioneer ways, who were kind of modern life had not touched these regions, and that really probably the Parkway didn't affect very many people, because after all everything was very isolated up there, and well, who would have been there for it to have affected? So the other myth about the Parkway that I think people think is that everyone welcomed the Parkway. We all love the Parkway now, and we sort of tend to read back and think that going back, everyone loved it, and why who could oppose it? It's beautiful. But actually, as I mentioned, I started into the project with the question of Cherokee opposition to the Parkway. And that clued me onto the notion that the Appalachian region where the Parkway was built was a lot more complicated than people think it was. There were a lot of different groups of people. There were communities. There were people who had prosperous farms. There were urban areas. And there were people who didn't think the Parkway was going to be good for them. And so what I tried to do was to look at how all of those different groups and people interacted with the project. And I find that people whose land the Parkway was going to come through, a lot of times were not very happy about the news that the Parkway was coming. It was going to take a lot of their land. They weren't going to have any access to it. They weren't going to really benefit from it in any way. So there were those folks who were opposed. There were people that had had hotels and tourist enterprises.
It was going to be disruptive.
And that was going to be disruptive. And so they caused great heartache and trouble for those who were trying to build. So I try to put the Parkway in the context of any other big project like this. It was hard to do. It was complicated to figure out all of these costs and benefits.
Well, so that it wasn't just laid upon the land because somebody decided to do that.
No, what we will hear about is these landscape architects. And there's a common phrase that you'll hear, that they painted with a comet's tail across the horizon.
Oh my goodness.
And that's just not the case. It was very, very complicated, and at every point, any plans that the landscape architects or the engineers may have had to deal with the realities of people on the ground who would be affected by the project. Maybe you wanted to put it over here, but the people over here didn't want it over there. And if they were powerful enough, they could prevent you from putting it over there. And those were the kinds of issues that I tried to look at.
What were some of your primary sources? And I'd like to ask whether you encountered problems and what they were, and then just as importantly, who facilitated your work?
Well, I was fortunate and unfortunate in a way to realize that there were a lot of primary sources. For a federal project of this size, spanning almost 75 years, there's an awful lot of paper generated in the creation of that. But I was fortunate to be situated here in Chapel Hill when I started, because a lot of the sources having to do with the buying of land for the Parkway were right over in Raleigh at the State Archives. That's where the State Department of Transportation records are. So that was a great body of things that I used. Lots of records about tourism in the mountains over at UNC in the North Carolina collection there, and the Southern Historical Collection.
Right, yes.
Preeminent archives for Southern history. They had things like the papers of Robert Doughton, who was a very important congressman from Sparta, or Laurel Springs, North Carolina, who was very important in getting the Parkway started. And they had his papers, so people would write him letters about the Parkway or what was happening, and he would respond. That was useful.
So you had access really to original documents as well as publications and that kind of thing.
Many original letters and documents, lots of things, correspondence from the builders of the Parkway at the National Park Service that were in Washington at the National Archives. And then a big archive that the Parkway itself maintains at their headquarters in Asheville. So there were lots of sources, and you'll find this maybe amusing. It got to the point by the end of the book that if someone said to me, "Oh, there used to be great records at this courthouse, so-and-so, you ought to have checked those out, but unfortunately that courthouse burned down," I would be like, "Great, thank goodness the courthouse burned down," because I can't deal with one more sheet of paper about this project.
You have answered part of another question. What were some of the treasures you found and that you got into personal correspondence and legislators' correspondence? Those, nobody else had been into that.
Very little investigation of any of that had been done. A great treasure that I found at the National Archives in Washington was a letter from a man named S.A. Miller up in Obids, North Carolina, in Ashe County, right at the North Carolina. It's right at the North Carolina-Virginia line, Ashe County. People may have heard of West Jefferson as the main community there. But a letter from this man who was a farmer up there, writing to Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 or 6, saying, "Could you please help me with the Park-to-Park Highway? It goes through the middle of my farm. It takes 20 acres, and I'm going to have no use of this road, and they're not going to pay me very much for my land. What can you do to help me?"
Oh, and very personal.
It was very personal, and it was just a short 2 or 3 page handwritten letter, but in it, almost all of the problems with the Parkway were summed up in that one short letter from somebody who was not, powerful, not terribly sophisticated, but he understood that this was not going to be all that beneficial for him.
So, well, How did you decide on pictures, for example?
Well, the illustrations for the book, that was a somewhat interesting and frustrating process.
We have a picture of
and
one of her.
And we may have some photographs. This is an important photograph here that you'll see. This is a photograph of the plank road from the logging of Grandfather Mountain in the 1930s.
Oh, my goodness.
And talk about myths and realities. One of the major myths that I take on in the book is the myth that Grandfather Mountain's owner, Hugh Morton, saved Grandfather Mountain, a pristine wilderness, from the parkway, which he always said was going to go over the top of the mountain and ruin it like taking a switchblade to the Mona Lisa.
Oh,
this is something that you heard over and over and over through the media in North Carolina for the past 50 years. What I found in my research, however, was that in the 1930s, Morton's grandfather's family, who owned Grandfather Mountain, actually gave the timbering rights to Grandfather Mountain, or sold them, to Champion International. They ran a huge paper mill at Canton. And they logged whole sectors of Grandfather Mountain to the point where, you were talking about archives, people were writing to Congressman Doughton and saying, can you do anything to stop this destruction of Grandfather Mountain? And so in looking for photographs, being that a major myth was that Grandfather Mountain was a pristine wilderness that Hugh Morton saved, I needed some photographs that would show that logging. A great treasure was the photograph you just saw, which I found in the Parkway archives in Asheville, that showed one of the plank roads and logging. It's not a very clear photograph, but I had to include something visual to give people a sense that this logging was so destructive at the time. And so those kinds of things. Then there were other illustrations that I looked and looked for and never could find. Speaking of Grandfather Mountain again, Hugh Morton built a road to the top of Grandfather in 1952 to his mile-high swinging bridge. People may have visited this landmark attraction. People have seen it. But that building of that road, many of the Park Service observers commenting on that in the 50s said that was very destructive to the mountain. I wanted to see a photograph of that road right after it was built. Could not find one. The closest thing I found was a postcard of that road that was published by Mr. Morton in the 50s.
Surely you encountered some personalities that we'd like to know about.
Well, very much so, and of course lots of people have heard about Hugh Morton, and he's in there a lot, but there's some lesser known people that I found very, very interesting, and one of them I think you'll see a photograph of in a moment. Yes, there he is. Mr. R. Getty Browning. R. Getty Browning. And he was the chief of highway location for the North Carolina State Highway Commission. It was called then, the precursor to the Department of Transportation today.
Yes.
And he was the person in charge of deciding where highways ought to go that were being built in the state at the time. Well, because of a variety of events, he got to be in charge of deciding where the Blue Ridge Parkway ought to go on its North Carolina route. Of course,
and this is the man we're seeing here.
This is the man we're seeing here. He was famous for walking every mile of every highway route he ever laid out. He was an outdoorsman, a hunter, and he loved the mountains. And so here's a picture. Well, the picture you saw was of him walking with the Pisgah Mountain Range in the background, and supposedly he walked every foot of the Parkway route in North Carolina, which he was primarily responsible for laying out, and then the Park Service basically adopted his route. Now what's happened in all the years since then, he had a hugely important role, but it's almost been completely forgotten. Almost any story you hear about the Parkway only focuses on people who worked for the National Park Service. He didn't work for the Park Service. His story was completely washed out of history, but he emerged out of the letters and correspondence that I read in such a vivid way that there was no way to ignore him.
An important who of the Parkway.
Very important.
Well, another who question. How many who's? How many people visit the Parkway in a year?
The Parkway, for probably 40 or 50 years or longer, has been the most visited site in the entire national park system.
Oh,
a lot of people don't realize that. But as I mentioned, the park system encompasses something like 391 properties. And that includes national parks, national parkways, national memorials, national historic landmarks and sites. So there are a lot of different categories. But if you include all of those together, the Blue Ridge Parkway is the most popular site in the entire system. About 20 million people, 17 to 18 to 20 million people in the past, say, 5 or 6 or 8 years annually travel the parkway.
Annually?
Yes, annually. It's way, millions more than whatever's in second place.
Do we know where these people come from? Since it's a tri-state highway.
It's in 2 states. It's in Virginia and North Carolina. And
I thought it was.
And you're right to think maybe Tennessee, because that's one of the early controversies. There was an early route proposed that would have taken it into Tennessee, but the North Carolinians basically got organized politically and snatched that out of the hands of Tennessee and got it for North Carolina. And that's one of the stories that I tell.
But 20 million people. And as the population increases, we'll have more.
Yes, but one of the ideas with the Parkway and Shenandoah National Park and the Smokies was to put national parks near the population centers of the American East. And so, of course, that has worked.
Well, that was a good thought,
to bring the parks to the people, in a sense.
Well, what's the future of the Parkway? And it's my understanding from hearing you talk about the book and the Parkway that there's some sort of celebration coming up.
That's right. You know, the Parkway in the past few years has really been suffering under very inadequate federal budgetary allocations. There's an enormous maintenance backlog. There have been about 53 staff positions out of supposedly a full staff of 230 or so that are empty because they have not had the federal money to fill those positions, and these are important positions. And so the Parkway has really been desperate for funds and has been sort of operating on a shoestring. A couple of years ago, they weren't sure they were going to have money to print the maps that they hand out to visitors when you get to the Parkway. But there is going to be, so there are these budgetary issues. There are also issues of encroaching development, and I think we may have a slide that shows some houses that are in view of the Parkway up in Virginia. Maybe not, that there are always, views are being damaged by, yes, here we go. This is at Fancy Gap, where these tacky cabins have been built in view of the Parkway. Always the question is, how can you protect the views that we all value on the Parkway? You cannot own all the land that is part of the view, but there needs to be working with communities so they understand the value of the Parkway.
And then the anniversary.
And then the celebration. In 2010, there's going to be a big celebration of the Parkway's 75th anniversary.
You have given me a different view of history and what historians do. Do you have new projects like this coming up?
We do. My husband and I together have a small firm where we do contract historical research for the National Park Service. And one thing that we're doing, the Park Service really values historical studies in helping them think about how to manage the parks. And so we've just gotten through doing a historical study for DeSoto National Memorial at Bradenton, Florida, that will help them understand that park better, understand how it came to be and how it should be managed in the future. And we're doing another study now of the history of Cape Lookout National Seashore.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
And again, this study will inform the decisions that are made at Cape Lookout about how they manage and interpret the historic properties that they still have, like at Portsmouth Village and other structures that are sort of left over from the history of that area before it became a national park.
So this is history to help inform policy.
It's history to help inform policy. And that's really, in a sense, where I came to with the work on the Parkway as well, is that we need to understand this if we're going to protect the Parkway going forward.
We have about 3 minutes left here. Talk to us a little bit about new roles for historians beyond the classroom and learning about historical figures.
There's a whole field, and sometimes when we're in the academy, where I've spent a lot of my time in the university, we tend to think that all historians are in the university, and they spend a lot of time writing things that each other reads and talking to each other, and that's fine, and new knowledge is generated that way. But there are an awful lot of historians who work with the public more directly, who go on television programs like this, who work at our state archives, our museums, our national national parks, our historic sites, who advise on policy within the federal government in places like the National Institutes for Health and the State Department. And so I think there's really a place we all, almost in any realm, we can make better decisions if we know something about the issues, the conflicts, who have been involved in the processes, people's opinions, what's likely to happen in the past. And I can give a brief example in that someone proposed, people always ask me, well, the Parkway has budgetary troubles, why not have tolls on the Parkway? Just charge people a fee. That'll solve it. And I can tell them that 4 times that's been proposed in the past, and I can tell you who's going to oppose it if that's proposed again and why it won't fly. So those things are helpful in knowing what policies might work going forward, and I think historians can enter in those conversations even more.
You teach, and I don't know whether I've told people this or not, Anne also teaches at UNC in the history department, and I noted that you teach something called public history courses. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about?
That is
here?
exactly what I'm talking about, and I'll be introducing next fall the first Introduction to Public History course that's been taught for undergraduates at UNC. And that's just to give the undergraduate students an idea of the various and vast realms in which history is practiced and is relevant. And I hope to be able to, and maybe encourage some of them to go to work in those areas.
If you could tell us the main thing that we ought to take, and I hope people will be reading the book and we'll give you a little more information about that, but what should they take from all this? What are the kinds of things you would like to have the public know?
I would like the public to take the idea that the Parkway, if you love the Parkway, you have to work to protect it. And in that sense, you're no different from people in the past. There were a lot of conflicts over the Parkway, and the people who wanted the Parkway to come to be for the public to use and for the public good had to fight to make it happen. Some people were damaged in that process, and that's the process of working out any kind of big public project like this. But it wasn't easy in the past, and it's not going to be easy now. We're still creating the Parkway today, and we need to seize that role and become active in it if we want the Parkway to still be there in 75 more years for our children.
What do we need to do about participating in the celebration? I think we have a picture.
Well, there's a picture of the Blue Ridge Parkway license plates, and I'll just show that there. That's the one off my car, and it says Scenic, if you can't tell what that's supposed to mean.
Oh, Scenic is your, oh, that's your license plate.
Scenic. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is a private fundraising nonprofit that supports the Parkway. And for North Carolinians, an easy way to support the Parkway and help the budgetary situation is to get your Blue Ridge Parkway license plate for your car. That generates $20 every year that goes to the Parkway for support of programs largely in the realm of education for children and future Parkway stewards. And this has been the most popular specialty tag in North Carolina ever issued.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
There are over 20,000 of them out there now, so get in line, get yours, and that's one way you can feel that you're supporting the Parkway.
Will there be programs about this, you think?
There will be, and with regard to the 75th, there are things underway to try to do more substantial kinds of work to protect the Parkway, such as protecting more land and views.
Okay. Our time is up. We're delighted to have had you here today, Anne Whisnant. I'll show you the book, and I hope everybody will go to where to buy it.
You can buy it at the Bull's Head on the UNC campus, Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com.
Okay. We'll see you next time on In Praise of Age.
There's a myth going round town that when you get older you just sit down and start rocking, just rocking. In a way that's true if you know what I mean. Just take a look at the senior scene. Well, it's rocking, yeah, it's rocking. We're pulling our weight, learning the code, clicking our heels, sharing the load, and every so often we're hitting the road. Yeah, we're rocking.